Welcome everyone. It's so great to see such an international gathering on such a wonderful topic, and as we all socially gather here and learn together. My name is Dr. Chris Meletis. I'm a naturopathic physician. I live here in Oregon, and I'm a naturopathic physician for the last 28 years. Today we're going to talk about Niagen, and particularly nicotinamide riboside, as the driving force and the most efficient way to increase one's NAD levels within the body. So today's topic, the resilience in the face of cellular stress. And I think we've all had plenty of stress. And nicotinamide, adenine, dinucleotide, NAD, and of course the tool which I use in my clinical practice and personally take, nicotinamide riboside and immune health. So we're going to talk about lots of things today, and not just about immune health. We're going to talk about being well and supporting the physiology of the body. We all know that we have trillions of cells in the body, and of course those trillions of cells have to be fueled. So we'll chat a lot about overall wellness, autoimmunity, and other things as well. So when we go here and speak about the wellness factors, we look at many considerations, but a little bit about me first. So naturopathic physician, I've written 17 books, a couple hundred national articles. I was the dean at the Naturopathic University here in Portland for 7 years, from 1996 to 2003. And I think one of my claims to fame is I started the community clinics here in Portland that a lot of other naturopathic schools and other programs started doing as well, that we can both become educated but also do our social service at the same time. So today's discussion, how our cells use NAD to help rejuvenate natural energy pathways, and the mechanism of how it supports cellular repair. The fact is that our NAD levels from the age of 40 to 60 drop 50%. So once again, so anybody from 40 to 60, our NAD levels are dropping. Well, now we think about that, any cell, whether we're doing work with adrenal, thyroid function, cellular healing, wound healing, we need, of course, have adequate NAD and adequate mitochondrial function. And what's interesting is I shared with you from the age of 40 to 60, NAD levels drop by 50%. But for every decade from the age of 30 to 40, we lose 10% of our mitochondrial function, all things being equal, another 10% for every decade after that. So when we start looking at illnesses, susceptibility to viruses and whatnot, it's no wonder that if we're underfueled, our body can't function properly. So how stress affects the immune system and the virus, we know the more stressed we are, and cabin fever and being sequestered, of course, is a stressor, and that will lower NAD levels. But also viral infections disrupt NAD homeostasis and cause a depletion. And we'll have some slides on that showing that over a 25-hour period of time in a model that is done, that we actually see a precipitous drop of NAD. The other thing which is interesting is in the aging population, NAD levels compared to norm, quote unquote, whatever norm is about only 20 to 25% in the lung. So no wonder respiratory illness and susceptibility is much more common in the aged, and also those with comorbidities. The published data at this juncture is actually very clear that we're looking at NAD precursors, and the fact that there's only one precursor that the data is actually showing from not only the FDA perspective, the European Union, the Australian, and the Canadian regulatory bodies, is nicotinamide riboside is the precursor which has been approved to actually increase NAD levels. And once again, the clinical evidence and cellular benefits of increasing NAD with nicotinamide riboside is going to be one of our topics today, with lots of information from the peer review literature, the science. And so as I shared with you, as you can see on the second bullet, 50% drop of NAD. So my patients often ask, well, should I take NAD? And so if you're working on energy pathways, if you do a lot of organic acid testing, you're working on a citric acid pathway, or you know that there's a mitochondrial inhibition going on. Maybe they're taking metformin or a statin drug or a beta blocker or a whole litany of meds that actually have been shown to cause mitochondrial dysfunction. And there's over 300 different health conditions associated with mitochondrial dysfunction, and they present as the big things in our clinical practice: the fatigue, the cardiovascular disease, the fatty liver, and onwards. So we really want to support the mitochondria. And once again, NAD is, of course, essential for cellular energy production, and low NAD levels contribute to diminished energy. So we're going to have decreased cellular repair, diminishment of NAD, which becomes a catch-22. And as I share with my patients, and of course, all of us as educators try to come up with something that our patients can understand. So as I glance down here at my iPhone, and no, I do not work for iPhone, so I'm not promoting iPhone, but if I did not have a battery charge to my iPhone, well, how good would my iPhone be? It would not be very good at all. It'd be a glorified paperweight, $1,000 paperweight. But remember when we used to call our phones cell phones? Well, I say, well, imagine this is your cell. And so my patients are, okay, I get it, you cell. Well, what happens if we're at 5%? Will all our functions work? No. If we have no charge, will there be the optimal function or the application of our DNA? And so I say the apps on your phone are like your DNA, and will your DNA work if there's no charge to your battery? Like, no, that's actually a great little analogy. So this is how I describe NAD and mitochondrial function to my patients. So the most efficient way for us as clinicians to increase NAD levels in the body is with Niagen, the nicotinamide riboside. Lots of peer-reviewed literature, it's patented, has lots of preclinical trials, which we'll discuss, as well as human clinical trials as well. But we go from nicotinamide riboside to NMN to NAD. And lots of people say, well, why can't we just use NMN? Well, that's because there's no studies showing that it actually increases it. Plus, it doesn't enter the cell, and so it has lots of limitations. So when we look at those limitations and we look at NR, NR is the most efficient way of doing the NAD endogenous support to teach a person to fish opposed to merely giving them a fish. Plus, once again, NAD and NMN doesn't have the research showing, once again, the clinical outcomes. Most of us in clinical nutrition back in the day learned about pellagra, the 4 Ds, D as in David, and dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, and of course death. That was of course one of those big Ds that we don't want. So we learned about vitamin B3 deficiency. And of course we also learned in nutrition that we convert tryptophan into niacin, but very inefficiently. But why would the body convert 30 or 60 milligrams of tryptophan to merely 1 milligram of NAD? Because it's critical for life and sustaining life. And when we go from merely surviving to wanting to be thriving, we have to, of course, have the energy to do that. So once again, as we look at epigenetics, NAD status is an epigenetic consideration, and how do we support those NAD levels? So we're now seeing more and more research from the 2000s onwards showing all these pathways, all these signaling molecules, sirtuins and PARPs, and thanks to the work of Dr. Brenner's, we see even more and more research, and this is how nicotinamide riboside, or known as Niagen, came to play, as well as now a tool for us in clinical practice. So of course we have foods, we have our NAD, we have ATP production, and many things, food, medications, xenobiotics, toxins can poison our mitochondria. And or, once again, we can be low in a nutrient. So if you're doing organic acid testing, oat testing with your patients, you know that citric acid cycle, you can get stuck anywhere from citrate to isocitrate, cis-aconate, alpha-ketoglutarate, succinate, all the way up through the oxaloacetate. Any of those pathways can get skewed. And if you see patients that are anxious, can't concentrate, attention deficit, in my clinical practice, I see that alpha-ketoglutarate elevated. Well, right before and right after alpha-ketoglutarate on citric acid cycle, it's NAD dependent. It's the same thing with pyruvate and pyruvate dehydrogenase. So you see all these needs for energy and energy pathways and ensuring our food is actually being processed properly. And so when we're trying to lose weight, while we're trying to do healing and repair of our RNA and DNA, we once again have to have the NAD co-enzymes to conserve and support homeostasis as we have such an excess allostatic load. So we know that intermittent fasting can support sirtuins. We also know that PARPs are critical also as cell signaling enzymes, and both sirtuins and PARPs are altered when there's viral illnesses and burden that are altering our homeostasis, our ability to stay balanced in our body. And so we want to ensure that we have that fueling pathway. And many of us know the statistics. For magnesium, for example, there's 300 plus different enzyme pathways that magnesium plays a role in. For B6, there's some 60 different enzyme pathways. Well, in this case, our cells need to have that mitochondrial support of NAD. So you name the function, whether it be our adrenals and we're nourishing the adrenal glands, we're working on a person with hypothyroidism. Well, once again, the thyrocytes, the hepatocytes, the adrenal cells have to have the energy to take the nutrients we're giving them, the food, the mindfulness, and do something with it. But without the energy, you can give all the tools in the world, all the nutrients in the world, but it has to have the energy to integrate it to support cortisol levels and thyroid levels. And this is how I integrate the NR, nicotinamide riboside, Niagen into my clinical practice as a supportive factor. And of course, with aging or medications, it becomes even more relevant. So when we look at NAD synthesis, we once again look at declining NAD levels and the hypothesis to driving and decreased sirtuin levels. And once again, the mitochondria as we age is part of our problem. And one of the books I wrote called Longevity, I talk about the concept of mitotricity. It's our electricity, it's our currency of our cells. But NAD supports the sirtuin activity and our mitochondrial health. So, and these are the things we now know. And most of us, when we graduated, we knew what we knew. And now as we've been practicing for years or decades, in my case, we're like, darn, we didn't even know that. But if we know the foundation of how the body works and that the mitochondria, the NAD, we don't have to know all the pathways yet. We just know that we eat well, we take care of the GI tract, we support the mitochondria with things like NAD in the form of nicotinamide riboside as a precursor molecule. Then we can trust the innate wisdom of the body to do the things we haven't yet researched or found out in the scientific literature. When we see the aging process, and you see on the left-hand side, and you look at the lung, this is percentage of the norm, quote unquote. And you can see the lungs, as we get older, are very susceptible because we don't have the NAD. So how are those pulmonary cells going to, and the cilia and the secretory IgA, all this, how is it going to work when we get burdened by an illness or any other factor? And of course, if it wasn't for oxygen, we wouldn't exist. Kind of lungs are important, huh? And so you can also see with fatty liver, lots of times fatty liver, if you can get a person with a fatty liver, we can actually go towards fibrosis. I have patients which have had diagnosed liver fibrosis and cirrhosis secondary to a fatty liver going wayward. And I've asked them before, well, what's your risk factors? They haven't consumed alcohol since college, and they live a clean life. One of them I'm thinking about is a school teacher, and she lives a very classical little house in a prairie school teacher life, but she has liver cirrhosis and fibrosis secondary to fatty liver. Fatty liver, of course, associated also with mitochondrial dysfunction. And one might also wonder, as you look at the statistics here, I wonder what her NAD levels are. So obviously I have her on NAD along with other mitochondrial support. But maybe we're working on neurological health, and maybe we're working on other factors. There's even research showing Duchenne's muscular dystrophy in a modeled effect, actually. So they're looking at that as a medical model opposed to actually Duchenne's patients. Once again, there's a consideration here that NAD levels play a role, but in today's environment, we actually see infection is a huge item that drops our NAD levels. And this is when we need our immune system to work more than ever. Our mitochondria actually play an integral role in immune function. In fact, it produces a substance called MAVS, M-A-V-S, at the mitochondrial membrane that actually determines not only how we respond at a cytokine level, but also how we rally our antiviral immunological support. After all, our immune system also has to have the energy to get the job done. So as you see here at the bottom of this slide, it says cited monograph upon request. So if you want to actually have the details, at the very end, there's going to be a couple emails addresses that you can request to have the monograph sent to you, which goes through all the research, all the science, and it's a very nice little document that you can share the knowledge with other colleagues and understand why we're making these recommendations. But we also see the same thing with Alzheimer's disease as well. So you can see a lot of clinical application here because after all, we're supporting the innate capacity of the body by supporting the mitochondria with the nicotinamide riboside that supports NAD production. So as we go here in cellular health and supporting the intrinsic pathways, we have all kinds of burdens. We have our cognitive challenges, we have our psychological ones, we have vitality, just the energy to show up every day and wake up. We have, of course, all the input, and heaven forbid we watch too much news. I kind of only wonder, well, what does that do in terms of our brain chemistry? What does that do to our adrenal glands? Because we are now fed so much information, unlike the late 90s and early 2000s where they had the commercials, can you hear me now? Yes, we can't stop hearing. all the feedback on social media, and so we're all burdening the body. We're no longer in Kansas. So what we want to do is support the intrinsic capacity, support the epigenetic components, support the body, because it is more stressed than ever with all the chemicals and toxins and toxic environment in which we live. So once again, NAD plays a critical role because we're supporting the cellular function. Many of you are also very familiar that the mitochondrial DNA actually has a T3 thyroid receptor. So even our mitochondria, as we're working with thyroid patients, as we start giving them thyroid, they start feeling better. Sometimes they'll plateau after a week or two. You kind of wonder, now I've stimulated the mitochondria, have I become rate limiting factored on another level? So this is where I also give a lot of nicotinamide, riboside, Niagen for my patients that were supporting the thyroid, because now I'm speeding up the human metronome, the tick tock, and I describe the thyroid to my patients as the maestro in front of a large orchestra of the trillions of cells. But if I ask the body to work harder, and I've given now some thyroid support to have that happen, now the question is we're going to be burning through fuel and other cofactors more quickly. So once again, I use that for my adrenal patients as well as my thyroid patients as well, because now the body has to have the energy to do the next step of digging itself out of the hole. So as we look at the peer review literature, Dr. Rajman and his group et al. Did a really nice job of looking at where the scientific literature is. And you can see what is the role of NAD in the body, even fertility. So if you're helping couples work on their fertility, kidney, renal protection. I have people with polycystic kidney disease. I'm once again wanting to support those functions as much as possible. Likewise, when we're looking at brain function and liver function, and once again, the goal here is nicotinamide riboside, work on a healthy diet. Can't beat a healthy diet, as I share with my patients. You supplement a good diet, you don't substitute it. That's why they're called supplements and not substitutes. And of course, exercise, absolutely critical, but great little information out of the peer review literature. So they're catching up. And when we look at endothelial function, many of us are very familiar with the glycocalyx. All of us are we're all very familiar with endothelial function and nitric oxide production, but the glycocalyx actually is the protective factor, like little hairs that protect the endothelia. And so once again, knowing that even though many of us when we went to school didn't know about the glycocalyx, when we have mitochondrial support, we actually have the building blocks, we're actually supporting the body foundationally, even beyond our knowledge, once again, just like with a good diet and lifestyle. And then what we look at is from a signaling perspective, look at all the roles of NAD within the body. We have the mitochondrial function, redox reactions, our circadian rhythm. If you're familiar with the literature on COVID, there's even peer-reviewed literature. If you go to pubmed.gov and type in melatonin, there's actually a peer-reviewed literature about melatonin and the circadian rhythm. We know when we're tired, we're not restoring our body, because after all, restoration, R-E-S-T, restoration. So once again, we have to support that circadian rhythm. And on Medscape right now, there's literature showing that the higher the cortisol levels, if a person has COVID, the higher the risk of a bad outcome, all things being equal. That was just populated on Medscape yesterday and the literature. So once again, but if we know we're supporting the adrenal glands by supporting the NAD levels, we're supporting the cells and then letting the innate wisdom of the body do what it needs to do. And then we go ahead and look at the molecular knowledge that we now know. And can you imagine 5 years from now or 10 years from now, what will we know? When I was giving a lecture at our local MD medical school, I was part of an NIH grant, and I was part of a curriculum committee for the local medical school, Oregon Health Science University. And I had the privilege of lecturing and presenting to the fourth year graduating students. And they were sitting in an auditorium that had graduated people from the late 1800s. And I says, can you imagine how much, and this applies to all of us, can you imagine how much smarter you are? And I'm speaking to these ready to graduate fourth year MD medical students, how much more you know than people 5 years ago that sat in your chair, the diagnostics, the therapeutics. I mean, things are just growing exponentially. I said, but remember, 5 years from now, they're going to feel the same way about you and your knowledge unless you're a perpetual learner. And that's the beauty of us being functional medicine providers. We're asking the bigger questions, but realizing, as you can see here on these receptors, the PARPs, the sirtuins, the CD38s, this is what we currently know. And this was as of 2018, a nice graphic from Rajman again. But can you imagine how much more we're going to know 5 years from now? But once again, if we support the body innately by supporting the mitochondria, once again, it just makes good sense, like diet and lifestyle and a healthy GI tract. And so then we look at the aspects of NAD and immunity. And so here's a nice slide. It's from 2016, showing that when an infection occurs, NAD levels come and rally. It's dependent. There's a demand. I need more NAD if I'm in an immune system. And as a result, I'm going to cross chemotaxis, and I'm going to create a whole milieu of responses to defend the organism, that being us. But now, of course, that's going to become a critical issue. And as you can see in the peach colored portion of this graphic, infection, and then there's a drop of ATP. Lots of times when we get ill, we get tired. And with the current virus going around, fatigue is one of the big issues, extreme fatigue. I've had many patients, including my colleague, that ended up with a COVID-19 infection, diagnosed and confirmed. And once again, fatigue is a big issue. But once again, we're depleting our NAD as we save the bacon. We're throwing everything at it to the detriment of other functions within the body. So as we look here at NAD, it plays a critical role, as you can see here in the quote, important to acknowledge the importance of maintaining NAD levels for the activation of metabolic sensors, correcting function of host cells, and it depends on the intricate connection between processes that drive cell survival, proliferation, host defense, and modulation of NAD levels is predicted to affect effector functions of immune cells and consequently the clearance of persistence of infection. Once again, that's a quote out of the literature. So as we're looking here, once again, it makes good sense, but it gets even more exciting and interesting because as we look here at viral infections and the depletion, look here at the top graph, here's a mock infection versus an infection, and you see viral infections quickly deplete NAD cellular levels. So in the red, you can see over a 25-hour period of time where NAD peak intensity occurs. So once again, tremendous drop. So if you are aged, if you've been stressed, if you've been worn out, might there be an increased susceptibility, not just from the adrenal gland perspective, not only from sleep, not only from all the other things that alter homeostasis, but if your NAD levels are already not replete and they're somewhere on the pathway of deplete, you're going to be wide open possibly to have poor sequelae, all things being equal, in my clinical opinion. So as we look at infections, they trigger cellular defense, and of course it causes a cascade. Lots of us as functional medicine providers do a lot of food sensitivity testing. As you probably already know, IgG 1, 2, and 3, because there's 4 IgGs, activate complement. And so now the complement pathway, another immunological pathway, it requires energy to, of course, have that function of chemotaxis and the other pathways. So we want to support this pathway. Once again, it takes NAD, and of course, this is why I use nicotinamide riboside in my practice. So other viruses like COVID, coronavirus, implement anti-cell defense mechanisms that thwart cellular defense systems, and viral insults decrease the levels of NAD and related compounds. So once again, part of that process of defending is you have to have, and I'm going to say this ever so gently, the army, your immune system, ready to bring on the fight if the fight comes. But as we learn from the mitochondrial side of things, the MOVs, which control the cytokine storms, the mitochondrial pathway is integral to actually regulating that, and it has to be properly fueled. So then we look at some peer-reviewed literature, and of course, we live in a very interesting historical time when it comes to, of course, this virus that has impacted us and other historical events which are occurring in our nation and around the world. Viral infections lead to marked depletion of cellular NAD, and you'll also see here on the third bullet, sirtuins act as energy and inflammatory sensors in the cells, but you must have adequate NAD for that to work. Likewise, the second bullet, PARPs block viral protein synthesis and replication. But let's say we give a person zinc, and we say, here's some zinc, it might help your immune system. It may not, but because of course we can't make claims on something like zinc, but let's say we believe zinc's gonna be helpful. But doesn't the cells have to have the energy to take that zinc in? Maybe we want to use vitamin C for a virus of some sort. Well, once again, the body has to have that ability to take that in. So this is where mitochondrial support and once again, the nicotinamide riboside comes into play. As you can see here, sirtuins also deacetylate proteins and deactivate the inflammasomes and reduce inflammatory factors like interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor. And also, the stronger the response, the greater the innate depletion. So if you bring on your vital force, your vitality, your application of chi, and you're saying, I'm all in for this fight, well, you're also all in and allocating all your energy towards NAD being allocated accordingly, which is going to drop other factors within the body, which are critical. So this is where we start seeing cardiovascular anomalies and other sequelae that ultimately can impact people with viral illnesses. So the virus didn't necessarily cause the ultimate, outcome, as well as other things that are now starting to become underfueled, in my opinion. So as you can see here in 2020, the impact of PARPs and NAD and inflammation and host pathogen interactions, great little article. And sirtuins and immunometabolism and sepsis. Once again, our bodies, when they get overwhelmed, they start becoming more on the septic side. But if you look at this title, it's a compelling title. I'm only going to read the title because it's in the peer-reviewed literature. But of course, we as providers could never make this claim. But it says here, the molecular story of COVID-19, NAD depletion addresses all questions in this infection. It's an article definitely worth reading. And it speaks to the fact that, once again, we know intuitively that NAD and mitochondrial function is critical for the performance and preservation of the body. And likewise, you can see here another article, COVID-19 infections, a perspective on immune responses. But NAD enzymes play a key role in all the stages of a viral illness, and it's depicted molecular pathology pathways of COVID. Almost all procedures lead to or originate from NAD depletion. And of course, we know the stage 1, 2, and 3 of a viral illness. So I'm not going to go over that ad nauseum, but we need to, at the very get-go of intruder knocking on the front door of our body, it was like, okay, we need to be guarded. We need to have all these things ready to go. But once again, NAD dependent. And the most susceptible to COVID-19 infections are those that are NAD deplete. And I just got done getting a double hernia procedure done 2 weeks ago. I was going to go and, of course, have the surgery. So I'm cranking up my NAD because I'm going to get exposed to, of course, pathogens, nosocomial infections. Plus, I had to support all the healing processes so that I had optimal function. Plus, things like propofol actually have been shown to cause mitochondrial dysfunction. So whatever meds went on board while I was asleep taking my little 2.5-hour siesta, I wanted to make sure my mitochondria are working for me and they were fully loaded ahead of time. That was my goal, my vision. But once again, if you look at the risk factors for NAD depletion, obesity, diabetes, all of these things are risk factors, as well as being just stressed out, I think, which most of us are to some degree. So when we look at SARS-CoV-2 impacts, NAD gene expression patterns, infections result in the up and down regulation of NAD and metabolome genes, down regulation of PARPs 1 and 2, SIRT1, and also DNA repair gets altered as well. So once again, as we're tending to the garden and keeping out the vermin, we're at the same time now leaving other parts of our body potentially less protected. The upregulation of the NAMPT pathway evolved in the salvage pathway for NAD generation. There's quite a bit of research showing that, once again, the most efficient way to create NAD is through this pathway. So we want to go from nicotinamide, riboside, NR. We want to go through the NMN to make our NAD. That's the most efficient and proven pathway. Boosting the NAD through the NAM and NR kinase pathways may restore antiviral PARP function to support innate function against viruses. Once again, informational. Of course, we have to apply this in the greater picture of clinical education and the clinical picture. And then we look at cells that defend themselves from a virus. They deplete their NAD levels. So once again, now they're all in defending themselves, but can they do their other functions within the body? Of course, if you're underfueled, it's hard to actually win the race. And so the corona infections induce a set of PARPs family members that includes enzymes required for the innate immune response of COVID viruses. Overexpression of PARP enzymes deplete the NAD. An example, PARP10, and there's multiple PARPs. And overexpression of PARP10 alone can deplete NAD+. And we also see inhibition of PARPs 1 and 2 and the recovery in NAD. There's all these processes going on, those that we know, those that we don't. But as long as we know at the beginning of the day and the end of the day that we've supported the mitochondria and our NAD levels, then we can just count on the wisdom of the body. as well as the other nutrients and support we're giving to a person. And when we look at the two-phase approach to coping with a viral illness, you can see here in this nice graphic, the early stage of a velar macrophage, remember those dust cells, and then we got the neutrophils. So we know the moment the neutrophils crank up, inflammatory responses occur, and we end up basically start self-destructing, and we have to now support the supportive processes to allow for that protection, allow for an adequate but not excess inflammatory response. We know an inflamed response, as the Latin rubor dolor color toler, warm, hot, swollen. This is okay to a point. It actually prevents you, if you sprain your ankle, from further injuring yourself. But for so many people in today's world, we have inflamm aging, where we're so aged already from all the inflammation, CRP, interleukin 6, before we have an insult within our body, that we, once again, we have the crescendo. It's already an avalanche waiting to happen, and then the precipitating echo in the valley triggers the avalanche to occur. So we really want to support this protective mechanism. So immune bolstering, immune suppression, also critical because of NAD. And once again, there's a balance between CD4 and CD8 helper suppressor cells. And we learned this way back in the days when HIV technology and knowledge was coming out. Balance CD4, CD8. Now we know so many more CD receptors as well. So maintaining NAD critical. So now we look at the pathways. We look at the de novo synthesis, the one I mentioned early on. We have 30 or 60 milligrams of tryptophan. It goes through multiple steps, and voila, you got a milligram, 1 milligram from 30 to 60 milligrams of substrate of tryptophan to make 1 milligram of NAD. Very inefficient. We have the Priest-Handler pathway, where you can actually see multiple steps. But then we got our salvage pathway. Salvage pathways, that's where the Niagen, as in the case of Tru Niagen, the supplement, comes into play. And you can see where Dr. Brenner, the one that did a lot of the research here, and he was a pioneer in this area. He's the forefront. He brought it to us. He says, this is how you can do it. Take nicotinamide riboside, it'll go through the NMN pathway, and you're gonna create NAD in a very efficient way. So we got B3, and you could theoretically take B3 and hope that it's gonna eventually get down through all these enzymatic pathways, but we're all very familiar with SNPs these days, those polymorphisms. So just because we give a person folate doesn't mean they're gonna make MTHF, because people have either a heterozygous or homozygous MTHF polymorphism. Same thing with catecholamine, transferase, MAO. So likewise, you can imagine all these enzymes, we all have various polymorphisms. So the less steps we have to take, it only makes good sense, the more efficient we're going to be. So limitations, niacin causes flushing, we know that. And it also can, and NAM, another way that some people tried to actually increase NAD, actually inhibits the sirtuins. This, of course, not only can inhibit our viral protection, but multiple other pathways. The de novo pathway, as I mentioned, because of all the steps, very inefficient. And there's many rate-limiting enzymes that have been shown with aging and stress that just make these very inefficient, whereas the salvage pathway that Brenner was very brilliant to having discovered and elucidated actually is the way to ultimately go in supporting it efficiently and reproducibly. And the nicotinamide riboside does not cause flushing. It does not inhibit the sirtuins. It's a short two-step pathway, and NRK is activated in conditions of stress. So once again, very important to understand that our bodies knows what to do as long as we support it. So once again, exogenous NMN, which is not, in my opinion, the way to go, must be converted to NR. So you can say, okay, I'm going to give NMN and hope it's going to make it down this pathway. Why not just give NR and get the job done? So NMN must first be converted to NR. So once again, lots of steps, lots of different pathways. And just like we might decide we're going to give a person pyridoxal 5-phosphate, the active form of B6, or we might give a person methylene tetrahydrofolate or quadrafolate, because we're going to bypass all those other potential obstacles or distractions. And every enzymatic pathway takes energy. In our body, when we're trying to help a patient, it's not to take more energy for them to figure it out themselves, but it's rather to get the job done. So when we look at these pathways, NAD, including IV administration, because many of us are very familiar with NAD, but the question is, are we really doing our best for our patients? And once again, to let the literature speak for itself, and that's where you'll want to ask for the monograph, which you'll have the emails at the end, and I'm going to field some questions at the end as well. And we're going to allow you to then decipher it yourself and see the literature. But NAD, including the IV administration, and NMN, lack the research. It just doesn't have the research, and our patients count on us to vet through the research to deliver the best item possible. Then we have NAD and NMN are large phosphorylated molecules, so they don't like to cross over membrane molecules and membrane cell walls. And in a head-to-head, animals say NR increase liver NAD more effectively than NMN. And the availability of published clinical studies on NMN did not measure increases of NAD, and neither NMN or NAD as a preformed molecule have been notified as FDA GRAS approved, generally recognized as safe. So they really don't have a current legal status, which of course we, with relative to our boards and our regulatory licensing, we have to of course be delivering something that has some research to it whenever possible. So NMN is unable to elevate NAD levels in the brain. So once again, the point here is nicotinamide riboside is what I've chosen in my clinical practice to use because I've seen this literature, I've read through the peer review information, I've written on it. I'm going like, wow. But I can tell you, if you asked me a year ago, how much do you know about these different pathways? Not nearly as much as I do today. And now I make very much more clear clinical choices as a result of that. Wasn't mine necessarily bad back in the day because we didn't know. Now we know, thanks to the work of Brenner and the Tru Niagen folks. Supplementation with NR increased NAD levels in the cerebral cortex of neonatal mice and extended the lifespan of by 30% in mice with neurodegenerative model. So now you can think, well, what kind of neurodegeneration might we see in our clinical practices? I'm not going to say that due to regulatory minds, but think about neurodegeneration. We see it all the time. And so once again, whether it be elevated kinourinate levels, quinolate levels in the brain, which of course is another tryptophan pathway. It's like, So once again, why wouldn't we support the innate capacity and also the healing capacity, whether it be substantia nigra or other parts? So then we go to the data, because after all, when at the end of the day, it comes down to where's the research. NR is a well-studied nutrient across various treatment paradigms. You can see in the coloration here, the deep blue, the vitality, locomotion, cognition, sensory, psychological, pharmacokinetic safety, and basic research. From the 2012 onwards, boom, it's soared. And in the last 3 to 5 years, it's really kind of started coming into the functional medicine realm more and more on a regular basis. In fact, I would love to quantify that graph because we've all seen it, we've all heard it, we've all been trying to implement it, but with varying levels of success. And that's because, once again, the other forms of which we were trying earnestly to increase NAD just weren't getting the job done to hit the thresholds that we have double-blind studies to show. So here's an 8-week randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled, parallel arm trial. 140 healthy, overweight adults, so healthy and overweight. You can ponder that concept. And we have NR 100 milligrams, 300 milligrams, or 1,000 milligrams QD. So those doses daily. They measured the kinetics and dose-dependent effects of chronic Niagen. So that would be the Tru Niagen product that we have available as practitioners. And as you can see on the top graph, 100 milligrams over 7 days, 14 days, and 56 days. Gave a little peak and then kind of dropped off. At 300 milligrams, it climbed at the 2-week mark and sustained itself. And then at the 1,000 milligrams, it climbed up and it sustained itself. But how much did it increase? Well, here's the research. 300 milligrams per day experienced a statistically significant 51% increase in whole blood NAD within 2 weeks. And the increase was maintained throughout the remainder of the 8 weeks. So when I was getting ready pre-surgically, I was loading myself up and I chose the 1,000 milligrams, so 2 of the 500 milligram professional strength, to get my levels cranked up. And how much was that intended to do? Well, 1,000 milligrams per day from this particular study led to a 140% increase in NAD levels. So you can kind of say, well, I want to support my mitochondria. I'm going to go through surgery. I'm going to have to heal. And of course, nobody pays the bills if I don't show up. So I have to, of course, bounce back quickly. So many of us have that same circumstance, and we've experienced this under this historical event with this virus about keeping ourselves afloat as clinicians as well. And so we also want to see the increased levels sustained, and that's where the research is. Another study actually showed another impact, which I'm going to share with you, which is pretty impressive as well. But the research also shows validated safety and efficacy when used consistently over time. And so there was another clinical trial which actually showed for blood pressure support, how NAD played a role there. And it makes kind of sense because, once again, there's mitochondria within our GI tract, there's mitochondria within our endothelia. If we expect our endothelia or glycocalyx to work, there has to be energy. But once again, nitric oxide levels drop precipitously. So by the age of 50, our nitric oxide levels drop. So nitric oxide synthase, another enzyme. So we think beets, we think citrulline, we think all these things. But once again, it needs to have the NAD and be supported with the nicotinamide riboside in order to allow the citric acid pathway to work, but also the citrulline pathway to work to induce nitric oxide. So right now there's 10 plus published clinical human trials, multiple peer-reviewed studies on Niagen. So that's the product that ingredient you find in Tru Niagen. There's 100 plus preclinical studies, and there's 20 plus owned and licensed patents. The other thing, as functional medicine providers, as we face colleagues that still wonder, where's the research? Whenever a company offers the effort, the time, the resources to back up the claims, this validates what we do at a fundamental level, because it says there is research showing things, just like when we see vitamin D research, IV vitamin C research. So whenever a company helps support the validation of functional medicine with studies, of course, I like to vote with my dollar. So when we see here professional line, and so there's a regular 300 milligrams that's available to consumers. The 500 milligram dose, which is what I use in my clinical practice and for myself, and I'm taking 2 a day because I want to see that higher peak of NAD levels. And once again, statistically and significantly increase NAD levels, supports ongoing mitochondrial health, promotes cellular resistance and repair. And as I'm healing, I want repair, and I want to have the repair done quicker than not. And my life partner keeps on saying, don't lift anything, don't do this, but I'm repairing, I'm believing I'm repairing. So I'm feeding those mitochondrial pathways in a multitude of ways. Dosage and administration, 300 or 500 milligrams, 1 QD, 30-day supply, because these come in 30 size most often. Morning, evening, with or without food. I take mine in the evening because I want to have it just absorb and go through and not get lost in a whole avalanche of food. And once again, the 300 milligram is actually NSF certified for sports. So athletes that are looking to support themselves is important. I'm merely a half mile from my clinical practice to the international Nike campus. I have a lot of world-class athletes that I work with, and as well as weekend warriors that are looking to have that next level of performance. And I'm thinking of a chiropractor's wife that's a patient of mine, and in the onset of menopause, 50, 51 years old, she decided she's going to become a marathoner for the first time in her life. And she wanted to qualify for the Boston Marathon, Chicago Marathon, and New York Marathon. And so she thought she was plateauing because we had done an organic acid test. We wanted to make sure her fats, her carbs, and her proteins were working well. As we got all that dialed in, and I said, well, we're going to add the Niagen to your program. And she said, I think I've plateaued. I'm just not going to get there. But she personal recorded herself by 5 minutes. And then she was getting ready to qualify for the New York Marathon, because she already qualified for Chicago, and now with the personal record, she qualified for Boston. But now she was going to qualify for the New York Marathon, and she's on the well trajectory until, of course, COVID happened, and then, of course, the races are off. So once again, supporting the body, whether it be the weekend warrior, the person looking for weight and control or whatnot, where I'm just going ahead and supporting the innate wisdom of the body. And so there's no adverse effects observed in the clinical trials of Niagen. Of course, safety, do no harm. An individual experienced with Tru Niagen may experience a varying levels of cellular needs. So if a person's really deplete, they're going to notice things much more notably, because there's a lot of things to work on. That's assuming that we're doing our clinical work and supporting other aspects of their health as well, and removing as many obstacles to the cure as we can. But age, health status, lifestyle all impact the baseline NAD levels. The lower a person is, generally, I see in my clinical practice, the more they feel the difference. Regardless of their experience, clinical science shows Tru Niagen is working at a cellular level. Whether we feel it or not, it's working. And we know we drop NAD levels 50% from the age of 40 to 60, and our mitochondrial dysfunction increases 10% per decade from the age of 30 onwards. And surveyed reporters generally say, I have increased sense of vitality, I have more energy, which makes sense because you're recharging your proverbial AA batteries. From a regulatory perspective, you can see the Tru Niagen in the first column compared to other products out in the marketplace. And as you can see, the Tru Niagen multiple published human clinical trials, and of course, lots of preclinical trials, activates the sirtuins to promote cellular health. As you saw, a couple of the substances actually inhibit sirtuins. No known side effects in the human studies. It has the ability to be NSF supported at the 300 milligram dose, which is the one that was studied. So once again, important for the athletes that are competing at a competitive level, and legal for use and considered GRAS. As you can see, European Commission, Health Canada, USDA, FDA, and Therapeutic Goods Administration of Australia all have given the blessing to Niagen. So I'm open for questions. Greg is the VP of Chromadex, the mother company of Niagen, or you can also email practitioner@Tru Niagen. For those that already are very familiar with my work, you're welcome to reach out to me directly and ask questions as well. So I am going to open it up, and it looks like we have lots of questions. So let's see here. So the first few were just technical challenges, so they got that, of course, took care. I think this is all great stuff, and I agree. So this is, many of us already have our patients on tons of supplements already. This one to be added to a large regime is somewhat burdensome, a tough sell. My question, what can we measure either and how they feel, laboratory values to show the difference? Well, this is actually a great question, and thank you, Darren. The fact is, we know statistically our NAD levels are dwindling. And as a result, over the course of time, we can look at the various aspects of mitochondrial function. I like to do a lot of organic acid testing in my clinical practice, and we know there's a minimum of 4 major steps from pyruvate down through acetyl-CoA, we go from the isocitrate through alpha-ketoglutarate down through succinyl-CoA. We're also seeing from malate to oxaloacetate. If those pathways are clogged up, or what I call beaver dammed, then of course I'm going to use that as one of my measures. But of course I'm also looking for clinical outcomes as well. And so it is, for me, I look at it as a recipe expander. It actually is going to allow the various other supplements that I'm giving my patients, in my opinion, to work better, because whether it be the mitochondria or the adrenals, the thyroid or whatnot, it's going to allow those cells to do what their directives are at the DNA level. So that's kind of my thought, is I look at getting more mileage or a fuel additive to the process, while supporting pathways we don't even know the patient needs because they haven't manifested yet with enough brokenness to have symptoms. Brilliant question, by the way. If NAD supports the development of cytokines, how do we know to sure boost NAD? So it actually doesn't support cytokines. It actually helps with the modulation of the cytokine pathways by working with NAD as well as the MOVs. So it's another pathway. So it actually does not promote a pro-inflammatory pathway. I'm not sure if that's a question. If not, feel free to follow up with me. Are there any recommendations for use of kids? Kids is a great question. Just like we know that some of us have polymorphisms for other genes, there are certain health conditions where it may have some application for children. I would ask you to email me directly or through the practitioner portal or Greg, and I'll get back to you on that one as to the answer. Here's a question. In terms of cofactors, how do you feel bringing NR on with low vitamin D levels? Are there any other cofactors? I agree this COVID pathway is excellent. So of course, when we start supporting a pathway and we support the mitochondria, we start fueling, whether it be thyroid, adrenal, immunological, there still has to be the raw ingredients, whether it be zinc, vitamin C, vitamin D, to basically be taken up into the cell. So we're basically loading up and preordaining that the engine's going to fire, hopefully better, and that it's going to actually go ahead and allow for the innate function of the body to work better. But we still have to give the raw ingredients, the vitamin D, the zinc, and so forth. We're just hoping that a person's genetic potential is what it can be. I have a saying, albeit not very politically correct, genetics may load the gun, but diet and lifestyle pull the trigger, aka epigenetics. And so this is where people have all kinds of family histories, but we want to, of course, work on this. And as to the pediatric side of things, once again, if you email me, I'll share with you how I'm applying Tru Niagen in my clinical practice with pediatric population. It's been reported that corticosteroids are helpful in treating COVID, but you say increased adrenal production and cortisol suppresses NAD. Can you explain? So to kind of dissect that question, because that's a complicated but also very functional medicine question, and I can appreciate who asked it as well because they're a phenomenal thinker. The NAD levels will support cortisol production. And of course, we know there's two sides. So the allopathic literature is reporting high cortisol levels as being problematic. Well, high cortisol levels, of course, we know high cortisol levels are immunosuppressive. But at the same time, this is telling us that physiologically, this person's very, very stressed and they're not doing well. So is it really the cortisol levels that's a problem, or is it just a marker that there's such a dysfunction within the body? Now, of course, we know we have low cortisol and cortisone and low hydrocortisol production, which we classically see with adrenal insufficiency. These people are going to be much more prone towards pro-inflammatory pathways. So I'm thinking that this comment I made about Medscape and that higher levels of cortisol might be pathognomonic to a poor outcome, might be speaking to more of the fact that they're already adrenal tapped out, they're already maxing out, and they have left homeostasis a long time ago. But great question, and I'd be more than glad, and I know you have my email, so feel free to follow up on that one again. What has been your experience giving Niagen to polycystic kidney patients? Once again, I can't make medical claims, but my patient is maintaining their GFRs and their creatinine levels are stabilized. And so once again, individual results will vary. There's no perfect cure. And of course, in the regulatory environment of FDA and FTC, I can only say what I've experienced in my clinical practice. There are numerous studies showing the value of nicotinamide to cut the rates of squamous cells and basal cells. So, okay, so nicotinamide is another form of B3, as we all know, and nicotinamide has an application unique outside of the NAD levels. And so, likewise, this would be a totally different application. So would I use nicotinamide for possibly skin cancers per the medical literature? Possibly, but I would also be using my Tru Niagen as well. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but apples and oranges. And how can we get the papers that you were mentioning? Just go ahead and email either Greg or a practitioner at Niagen, and we'll get that to you. This person taking PQQ, can you take that along with Niagen? And actually, the answer is I do. Actually, I'm looking here at my list of pills that I take, and PQQ, CoQ10, and ubiquinol, MitoQ, and Tru Niagen are all part of my daily regime. And the way I think most of us help our patients is, what would we do for me or myself? And so that's my answer there. And so am I taking it? Do I have my wife on it? Do I have other patients and family members on it? The answer is yes. And so do I think PQQ is great? There's lots of literature showing, or at least suggesting, that PQQ helps with biogenesis and, more importantly, mitogenesis. And then, of course, the healthier and the more abundant our mitochondria, then we fuel them, potentially the better off. Is NAD good for Guillain-Barré syndrome? I would actually ask you to drop me in a personal email on that one. That's way into a medical claim category. I actually have a protocol I use for my patients that have came down with that, either post-vaccination or other presentations. So I can't actually make that comment publicly. So that's the end of the questions that I see. I'd like to thank you all. We have such a wonderful international gathering. And once again, a lot of the information I shared is clinical, my observations, and the information is from the peer review literature, of course, is from Tru Niagen. So I wanted to share from my passion, my heart, and my clinical experience as well. So I thank you one and all. Once again, if those that have my email address, feel free to email me, and I'll be more than glad to assist. And or you can also get information as well through the other pathways, and that ultimately will come to me or one of the phenomenal PhD researchers that can actually help you with any biochemical pathways, whether it be Dr. Yasmin or others, or possibly even Dr. Brenner himself. So thank you one and all, and take care and blessings.